Hello, everybody. First things first, just some business. This class is going to be migrate. I won't even say moving because we've been drifting. We started at Tuesday, Torah Tuesdays, and then we drifted to Wednesday, and we just kind of put started to put together a new schedule of learning for the fall, and the way it's working out. Partially because I'm teaching a new class starting Wednesday nights, starting next Wednesday night. So this class is going to move to Thursday at noon. Okay, so just like it makes some sense, or like the class wants to be closer to the Parshat, like it's like moving to closer to Shabbat, and also Thursday is a Torah reading day, and also just gives me more time to think. I like to be in the Parsha for as long as I can before we're all talking about it. But I really apologize if that switch doesn't work for anybody, if Wednesday was a better day, but it's going to be on Thursdays at noon, and I hope most of you can continue to join me. As you know, this is the class that I care about the most. This is the one that my heart is really all in. But having said that, I care about all my classes, and let me tell you just the two other classes that are starting up regularly. One, we've been running before the high holidays. Almost everything but this class went on pause for the high holidays. But we had a Mishnah class Mondays at noon that will be restarting this Monday with a very interesting and important Mishnah. And I just want to say I'm calling that class the Code of Jewish Knowledge, as for most promo kind of purposes, because a lot of people don't know what Mishnah is. Mishnah, the first rabbinic code from the third century. But I'm calling it that because I want, and please tell anyone if they ask, but I also want to say to you that I really intend that class, the Mishnah class, to be a class where you're just learning basic Judaism. And I think that's part of what the Mishnah is, or at least the basic Judaism, the rabbinic Judaism that we've inherited. There are two ways to learn. Like if you came and said, well, what book should I turn to just learn classical, basic Jewish laws, practices, rituals? The first is Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, but he's so clear and precise that it's a little boring, meaning, God forbid, but it's just very straightforward. Whereas the Mishnah is always weird and complex, and you're getting kind of the real core early discussions of what Judaism, how it came to be formed. A little like reading the Federalist Papers and trying to understand the Constitution, So that's Mondays at noon, and then I'm very excited to also announce this a week from today. We're at 6 p.m. In large part because of the response that I felt from this class, from this group, around some of the teachings that we did on Hazinu, on Parshat Hazinu, and where we really focused on biblical poetry. I just felt like people were so interested in that, and I'm interested in that, and there's so much there, and it's usually, I think, understudied. When we start to think about how much of the Hebrew Bible is poetry, basically all the prophets. So there's a lot there, and then a lot of the Psalms and the Song of Songs, Job. There's a lot there aside from the poetry of the Torah. So we have a new class starting a week from today at 6 p.m. On biblical poetry, and we're going to start, in the Torah, but then we're going to start spreading across and it'll also be just a good exposure to Tanakh, to the Hebrew Bible, in verse. But I say that to this group because I feel like this is a good. We'll run it like a seminar, so it'll be, as we usually do, a discussion and interpretation, and certainly not a lecture. So show up for that as well if that sounds interesting. But the heart of everything is the Parsha, and we're back studying the Parsha all over again. We're in our second cycle. Or not our second cycle. We're in another cycle, our 5,000th cycle. No, I guess you'd have to subtract whenever, like Moses, on cycle of reading the Parsha. and Ezra, really. But we're at the beginning, and it's always exciting. Every week is good in the beginning. Every week, there's no challenge in summoning excitement at the beginning, and certainly not this week. We're in Parshat Noach, the story of Noah and Noah's Ark, and it's such a good story that I hardly have to. I don't feel this is one area where I feel like I don't even need to tell you the story. It just somehow we all know the story. I mean, there's at least an ark and animals, right? Like we know that. And like probably we know the whole structure. Like God's mad at the world. God's gonna like destroy everything. And God says to Noah, "You're gonna be saved, and save all the animals as well." So like, and then he's on the ark for 40 days and 40 nights, right? So like you know the story. But I want to deal with what I think is really like the central question in the story of Noah from the perspective of the tradition of interpretation that we have inherited. I said last week that this season we're going to focus on Parshanut, on the tradition of Jewish interpretation, in part because I have a book coming out on the subject, so I want to like hype it, but also because that's a lens I want us all to know and to have access to and have familiarity with. The tradition of interpretation that stretches all the way back to the Mishnah, the Midrash, the same folks who are writing the Mishnah. But is sort of most famous for a style of interpretation that emerged in the Middle Ages that Rashi really sort of pioneered, if not the very first, the most famous, which is just a running commentary on the Torah. So last week we looked at Rashi and we tried to understand like what is Rashi up to? And in doing so, gosh, I feel like this is too long an intro, so let's get into it soon. But I guess what I want to say is, in looking at Rashi, what we did was we said, well, so Rashi's looking at something in the text, and there's something about the text that's bothering Rashi. That's the way our interpretive tradition works, is that there seems to be a kind of like a probing and a challenging of the text. You know, it's an interesting thing. It's a sacred text, but it's one that should be like confronted and challenged. And the thing that the interpretive tradition seems to present us with is a question, which is what is wrong with Noah? What's wrong with Noah? What's the problem with Noah? Because if we start to read our tradition of interpretation, we'll see that Noah, like not such a, he's not an out and out hero. He's not treated with a lot of reverence or veneration or respect by the rabbinic tradition. And that's weird because the guy saved the whole world, or at least was the person worth saving in the whole world. So let's start by looking at just like the opening verse in Parshat Noach. And in the opening verse here, you will see that from the text of the Torah, it appears here, I'm going to put it in the chat. From the text of the Torah, it appears that Noah is amazing, right? And the context of the story and let's take a look. Okay, so here we are, opening verses here, and Eila Toldot Noach. These are the generations, the legacy, the inheritance, whatever this word Toldot, right? So Eila Toldot Noach. Noach was a pure and righteous man. Noach ish tzadik tamim haya bedorotav. Oh my gosh. I in my translation, generations. This is important. This is my translation left out exactly the thing that we're going to be looking at. So Noah was a pure and righteous man in his generations. That's important. That's actually going to be the word that we use to kind of get into our discussion today, because he was Ish Tzadik Tamim Hayab Bidorotav, in his generations, and Noah walked with God. Okay, that's as good an intro as you can get in the Torah, I think. You're a pure and righteous man in your generations, and you walk with God. I mean, aside from the fact that he is the one person, one family saved on earth, I mean, that's it. That's pretty good. But there is a famous, last week we looked at Rashi, there's a famous Rashi that opens our Parsha on this first verse. Probably many of you have seen this or heard this before. And the famous Rashi records a debate, I think between Rav and Shmuel, but he doesn't say here. And the debate is like this. So in his generations, remember, it doesn't say he's pure and righteous, it says he's pure and righteous in his generations. Almost left that out of the translation. And Rashi says, well, some of our rabbis explain this to his credit. He was righteous even in his generation. And he lived in a crappy generation, one that deserved to die. So it follows that had he lived in a generation of righteous people, he would have been even more righteous. Okay? Like Noah lived during a terrible time and managed to be righteous. So my goodness, that's impressive. Others, however, explain it to his discredit. In comparison with his own generation, he was accounted righteous, but had he lived in the generation of Abraham, he would have, look at the Hebrew here, lo haya nechshav leklum, he would have been accounted as of no importance. In Hebrew, really, it's, he wouldn't have been thought of as anything. So, okay, I've been rambling on for a while here. Now let me turn it over to you and begin to ask the question, what's the problem? What's wrong with Noah? And maybe let's just start by asking it in a sort of a simple way, which is like, what's bothering Rashi here? In other words, but really what I want to ask is, what's bothering these other rabbis? Some of them think that Noah is righteous, and all the more so because of his generations, and others are starting to pick away at who Noah is and say, yeah, for his generation he was righteous. Why? What's the motivation there? And, that's what I want to know. And, as a kind of like accompanying question, I mean, who do you think is reading the verse right? I mean, do you think the Torah is telling us that Noah was meh? Or are the rabbis telling us that Noah was meh? Okay, so let's start to hear. And of course, we will begin with Noah Pollack.
Hey, thanks. I think I have a few issues. One, I seen it starting Noach ish Sadiq Tamim Haya B'Dortav, and he's the most righteous man of his generation. Now, the rabbis are saying if he was with Abraham, he wouldn't have been counted as so important. But then again, without Noah, we wouldn't have gotten to Abraham at all. And I was looking at Job, and he was also said as being blameless and upright, but I don't remember if it uses the same text as Ish Sadiq Tamim for Job. So there are pluses and minuses, but the main thing I have is in his generations and why it's pluralized. If these rabbis are saying if he was with Abraham, it wouldn't have mattered.
Yeah, good. Okay, Noah does something really important here, which is to point out that their immediate point of comparison is Abraham. That seems that's important. That's worth digging into a little bit. Why is it that because that'll be our next week's Parsha, right? That's the way the Torah works. So we have to take into account, it's like, imagine Adam and Eve, one Parsha, next Parsha Noah, next Parsha Abraham. So there's something like, oh, Noah, like, sure, Noah's fine now, but there's gonna be an Abraham. So why is that important? Yonatan?
Yeah, I think the mention of Abraham, even though we don't know a lot about his generation, I think that mention is very deliberate because there's a parallelism that's created between Noah and Abraham, put in a position to negotiate with God for the lives of countless people. And Abraham does a really good job of it. Ultimately, he's not completely successful, but really jealously fights for the lives of people who maybe don't deserve to live. Whereas Noah, I don't know, I kind of get the sense that he thinks they may as well die. And he just obeys God and lets humanity go into oblivion.
Okay, this is great. This is really great. So Yonatan sharpens the point of contrast even further by reminding us that Abraham is someone who heroically stood up to God when God said, "I am going to destroy not the entire world, but just a couple of cities." And Abraham really fought and lost, by the way, but at least he stood up and tried. You can't, what if there are righteous people there? Take a look. Let's see if we can do this in Sefaria here. Yeah. Take a look at, and the rabbis notice this as well, what Yonatan is pointing out, which is that the earth becomes corrupt. God saw how corrupt the earth is. God said, "I've decided to put an end to all flesh, for the earth is filled with lawlessness because of them. I'm about to destroy them with the earth." I mean, that's quite a thing to hear. I mean, that's a big sentence. And then God goes straight into so you make the ark and you do it like this, and you make it like this, and and I'm going to destroy everything. And look at this last line here in chapter 6. Noah did so. Just as God commanded him, so he did. That's where Yonatan and rabbis before him are saying, whoa, you just did it? Like, shouldn't there be a protest right in here? Shouldn't there be a big speech? Shouldn't you say anything at all? So great. So that's also, now we start to see, maybe we should have expected more from Noah. Okay, let's take a couple more thoughts, and then we'll move forward. Let's take more than a couple thoughts. Mari and I just met by phone, and now I'm like making the connection. So nice to, now we're like friends.
I'll go on video for that. Thank you. But to speak earlier too. Just to relate to what you asked last week, which was, sort of, why does it start here? Why does it not start with Moses and have this conception of land? I mean, what's interesting to me is you have this question of who's the first Jew, right? Like, we call them the Abrahamic religions. The religion comes from Moses. Abraham's the first man, and Noah's this sort of in-between figure, right? So not in any kind of Jewish supremacist thing, but thinking of the perspective of medieval rabbi, he's righteous in a generation because he's not yet a Jew. He doesn't yet have he walks with God. He's the first one to do it. Adam is kicked out. So he walks with God, but he doesn't have he has his own covenant with God, but he doesn't have the Jewish covenant with God. And he doesn't have yet the laws of Moses. So he's righteous because he doesn't yet have all these other tools that later come to be the Jews. In a way, he's like a righteous Gentile or a righteous among the nations, not in the Holocaust sense. And that I think might be what some of them are going for.
That is such an important contribution. I so appreciate that, Ari. I think that's exactly, we have to take that into account. That's one of the critical factors that is affecting rabbinic interpretation. That is to say, I think they just can't. I mean, Ari said a lot of it so well. I won't repeat everything Ari said, but I'll say just my sense of it, which is that I don't think they really understand what it means that right before we start the Jewish story, we've got this other massive hero. And it's kind of like, well, so on the one hand, there is a kind of tribal protectiveness, like, well, that's a non-Jew. That's not really the story. Forget about that. It starts with Abraham. But there's also a little bit, it's not just tribal protectiveness. There's also, I think, from a narrative perspective, they're trying to figure out, well, if Noah was so righteous, why didn't we start with Noah? Why didn't the covenant start with Noah? Why do we have to wait till Abraham, since after all, Noah was the one that was saved. Like, make the covenant with him. And Ari remembers correctly that we do get a covenant with Noah. Take a look at this. It's even happens to be on our source sheet. Right down here. I will establish my covenant with you, right? So it seems like Noah's poised to be the founder of our faith, and yet is not. And that's also like, that's something like we have to try and figure out. Well, so then what is Noah doing here just in the story? What's the point of the Noah story, right? And why is it lesser somehow? Okay, great. All right, let's see. Take one more thought from Joni.
I think it's a little bit like what Ariel was just saying. My question really is, we talk about lawlessness and Noah walking with God. What is our sense of everyone knowing the correct way to live? And there's this phrase, Noahite laws. I mean, how would one know what lawlessness or proper behavior is at that time? What's our sense of that?
Yeah, that's a very important extension of the thinking that Ari was doing just now, because that and Ari I think mentions this as well. This is like pre-mitzvot, pre-Jewish covenant. Like, we don't have a sense that there was something that Noah was supposed to do. Now, Abraham is also pre-mitzvot, but like Abraham seems to be starting a particular covenant, which will turn into the Jewish people. Noah is a kind of, it's just humanity. And indeed, as Joni points out, we use Noah as a kind of a touch point for thinking in Jewish tradition. The Talmud uses Noah as a touch point for thinking about, well, what is everybody else supposed to do? It's one of the kind of dilemmas of the Jewish religion. It's kind of good. We're not pushing our religion on other people. But on the other hand, we don't really have a vision. What's humanity supposed to be up to? And the Talmud says, well, there are Noahide laws that everybody was supposed to keep back in the day. Right? They're just these 7 laws. And those laws actually emerge at the end of our Parsha. And you know what? It's worth taking a look at them right away, because there is a kind of an opportunity here. We're going to skip to the end here. There's an opportunity here. This is after the flood. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And the fear and dread of you shall be upon all the beasts of the earth and upon all the birds of the sky, everything with which the earth is astir, and upon all the fish of the sea they are given into your hand. Every creature that lives shall be yours to eat, as with the green grasses I give you all these. That's all kind of like, it's like an echo of Adam and Eve Genesis stuff. You must not, however, eat flesh with its lifeblood in it. So don't eat animals while they're still alive. But for your own lifeblood, I will require a reckoning. I will require it of every beast of humanity too. I will require a reckoning for human life, of every human for that of their fellow human. Whoever sheds the blood of a person, that person's blood shall be shed, for in God's image did God make the person. So you be fruitful and multiply, abound on the earth and increase it. So there's this thing that happens after the flood where it does seem like Noah is getting a kind of a proto code, a kind of, here there was a mention of a covenant and now he's got a code, and it seems like maybe Noah could be the founder of a new religion or a new ethical system. And yet what ends up happening is that gets sort of put aside, put in the sort of like the scrapbook of that's just like on the side of Jewish discussion. Like, oh yeah, the Noahide laws. I guess the non-Jews will do those. They'll not kill each other. A few things, but we just move on from Noah. Okay. All right. So far, just in asking, like, what's wrong with Noah? What did Noah do wrong? Because we considered. I want to suggest we've considered so far that maybe Noah didn't protest enough. What else might Noah have done wrong? Is there anything Noah didn't? anything else that anyone wants to offer, knows about Noah, or just thinks about Noah in the story? Like, you know, these kind of contrasting thoughts, like, oh, he wasn't Abraham, where does he fit into the narrative? Those are important things to keep in mind. But is there anything we can actually charge Noah with? And Yonatan gave us one thing: he didn't protest enough. Anything else? I see Tali.
Well, actually, after coming out of the ark, here he comes out of and what happens? He gets drunk. You know, it's after he came out of the ark. You know, it's almost like he went on a down spin. Actually, you know what he did. But I was also wanted to still refer to what was said before, because it's one is walking with and one is walking ahead. And I almost think that Noah is really a teaching for us to see we have potential. We can be at a Noah place, or we can aspire to be an Abraham. But we have to be it's almost like here is the level of playing field, and where do we want to be? Do we want to stay here, you know, and just being obedient, or do we want to challenge ourselves, not only God, but challenge ourselves to be for our fullest potential?
Okay, all right. So the second thing you said is sort of like continuing to fill in the contrast conversation. But I want to seize on the first thing that you said, because it's also very important and much more of a distinct piece of evidence.
Right.
And that is that after the flood, Tali is right, that Noah, like we just saw, God says, I've given you all these new laws, and everything's going to be you're going to like start humanity again, and my covenant, and and there's a rainbow that comes. It's also nice. But then, as Tali points out, then it says, okay, so that's some time for you to start this new humanity. And the Torah says, Noah, the tiller of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk, and he uncovered himself within his tent. It's like very strange. The first thing that Noah does sort of in the world is to get himself some booze and then get drunk and then get naked and embarrass himself. And then when there's all kinds of midrashic discussion here that we're not going to go into, but when he realizes that he's been embarrassed somehow, he curses his son or his grandson, flies into a rage. When Noah woke up from his wine and learned what his youngest son had done to him, lots of discussion, what is exactly is that? Maybe just seeing him, maybe somehow, like making fun of him, maybe sexually, doing something terrible to him. He said, cursed be Canaan. So, okay, so there's more evidence that Noah's not quite right. And I will say, I think that it's fair to say, Tali's pointing us to the end of the Parsha. Yonatan was offering us some critique at the beginning of the Parsha. Everybody agrees that on the ark, Noah was good. You know what I mean? The bulk of the story takes place on this ark, and Noah did his job. Noah had one job, right? And he did it. And he saved all the animals, and he saved humanity by saving his family. And he weathered the storm, right? On the ark, Noah was great. So when we think about what did Noah do wrong, we're looking at either before or after. Like, was there some way in which Noah was too meek beforehand, too disinterested? Rabbi Browski, I think, gave on the sermon on this a couple years ago. And she talked about a famous Hasidic interpretation. I think it's the Kedushas Levi, who says that Noah was tzaddikim pelts, like a righteous man with a fur coat. Meaning, like, you're in the cold and you're like, I'm righteous, I'm right. You don't offer your coat to anyone, right? Tzaddikim pelts. It's like, all right. So is it that, or is it that afterwards we realize, like, what? Like, this guy who was supposedly saving everything also likes to, like, get drunk and take his clothes off and yell at his kids? Like, what's going on there? Right? All right. Let's take a couple of thoughts here, and then I want to offer one other possible layer of critique and analysis of Noah. So let's see, where were we? Alexandra.
I have a thought and a question. I'm not sure that I buy that the comparison between Noah not protesting and Abraham protesting is fair, because Noah is steeped in this. They're all around him, these evil people. And with Abraham, they're in these cities that he doesn't live in. And it's a lot easier to pray for people who are evil when they're not surrounding you and you're not steeped in their wrongdoing. But it's a lot more challenging when their wrongdoing is directly affecting you, which I assume it was, since it's of his generation. So I assume that the wrongdoing and the evilness was directly affecting him. So I think it's not quite a fair comparison, although maybe it's a fair critique that he didn't, but I don't think that it's a fair comparison because their situations were different. But my question is—
Wait, can I stop you there? I love that point. I love that point because there's something a little counterintuitive about, like, you think like the bigger disaster requires the bigger protest, but Alexandra's insight here, I think, is quite profound, which is that, first of all, it's further away, and it's these two cities that don't like, it would be very easy for us to now, in the safety of our, to cry out against, genocide in, well, let's say Rwanda, when it was. Like, that seemed, of course that's an outrage. But like, now the whole world is in a pandemic. Like, I just need, like, it's a total catastrophe. And Alexandra says it even better, which is that I'm in the catastrophe. It's not just, oh, there's a pandemic we're all suffering from. It's like the violence is in my country. I'm just trying to, the whole world has erupted with chaos. So maybe it's actually makes more sense to think that Noah was just taking care of business and less able to protest. Okay, I think that's a very good point. But you had a question as well.
Yeah, so I was wondering, in terms of the question, what did Noah do wrong? And I was thinking, did he ever express gratitude to God? And I was thinking, he sees this rainbow and it's so amazing. And I was thinking, what is a comparable moment that Abraham had? And I was thinking of when God took him for a walk among the stars. And I don't remember if this is interpretation or in the Torah, that Abraham did not feel alone when God took him for that walk, and like sort of expressed and connected to this godliness, whereas Noah— so that's my question, is that in the Torah directly, or is that interpretation? And is possibly what Noah did wrong, that he didn't connect to godliness, he didn't connect to—
That, I think, is also a very like keen reading of the story. That is, if I can just like extrapolate a little bit from what you were just saying, Alexandra, like, we don't see a lot of communication between God and Noah, or at least between Noah and God. God talks to Noah. Noah never says anything to God. It's not just that he doesn't protest. Noah doesn't, he walked with God, but he didn't talk with God. He doesn't have a relationship with God. And in as much as that seems to end up being the kind of the great concern of the rest of this story, what is it like to be in a relationship with God? Noah, for all of his good action, doesn't seem to be tuned into God. It is true that, in answer to your question, does Noah thank God? We cannot deny, here I'll just show you, that Noah builds an altar to the Lord. Afterwards, he does make a sacrifice, okay? So, I mean, and look, I'm not, like, the part of the point is I'm trying to like figure out that, Noah was not like a jerk. So he even built an altar to the Lord, and yet, yeah, you do have a sense that this is not a person in conversation with God, and that may be a factor as well. Lila.
Okay, I feel very overwhelmed by this parsha, and I actually don't even think Noah is really a main character, but that's another point. I just think like this argument might be a little problematic with the, he didn't argue on behalf of his generation, whereas Abraham did, and like, this idea of like Jewish protest, because I think it's like we have to like ask a bigger theological question, because in other moments in this class, like we've talked about, Moshe, like, and how he didn't listen to God in like a very specific way and was punished for it, and how like sometimes people in the Torah do what God tells them and we praise them for it, and then other times they protest and we praise them for that. And I think like it's complicated. Like he did what God told him. Maybe that's great. And like when God tells you to do something, you do it. I don't know. I just think we're inconsistent, and that's fine. But like, I feel like we have to acknowledge.
No, that's exactly right. And that's, yeah, in some ways you're making the central point most strongly here, which is to say, when we look back at that first Rashi, it's like some of our rabbis say that he was a good guy, and some of our rabbis say no, he wasn't such a good guy. It's like that's weird. In some ways, that's consistent with your analysis, which is like it's a mess. It's sort of complicated, and our takes on it could be complicated or inconsistent. We're picking things out, But I guess as you said, it could be simpler. And look, nobody really thinks Noah was a wicked man. Everybody admits like this is a story of a good. But it seems like, gosh, he just did what he was supposed to. So now we're looking for hints. We had a pretty strong hint at the end that something was going awry, right? We can make up hints at the beginning. We can make, I think part of what Lila's saying is like, yes, of course, we could say that it said Noah walked with God and Abraham walked ahead of God. But we're like, it feels like we're constructing a case against Noah where, I don't know, okay, it was a messy time and he did what he was supposed to, and freaking saved all of the life, species on Earth. Okay. All right. So I want to here introduce what I think is one of the core, one of the critical pieces of analysis of Noah's behavior, and it's one that I think you would completely miss without the help of the tradition of interpreters. I certainly would never have caught this. And we last week looked at Rashi, and Rashi is the most famous of the commentators. And Rashi is a medieval commentator, but Rashi, as we discussed last time, Rashi's kind of an editor and collector. This parentheses here, Sanhedrin 108a tells you that Rashi got this, and he's explicit. Some of our rabbis say this, some of our rabbis say this. Rashi is someone who is compiling earlier interpretations and sticking them in where he thinks that they fit, okay? So it's the most famous of the interpreters is actually in some ways more of a compiler than a composer, and that's striking. But that also tells us that and part of what I want to do with you today is we need to go back and look at the rabbis of the Talmudic period and see how Rashi is following in a tradition. He doesn't start something new. Interpreting the Torah based on this very careful parsing of the words is something that the rabbis came up with, that is stylistically. And in fact, this citation, Sanhedrin page 108, is an important citation. If we follow it, we go and look it up in the Talmud, we're going to see an entire page of Talmud devoted to interpretations of the Noah story. Entire story. And one of them, and I want to give you a little lead in here because it's so wild. The rabbis of the Talmud were so much bolder and more interesting than we are, than rabbis have become. Which is, okay, so they're in this story where Noah wants to send out the raven and the raven doesn't want to go. And one of the reasons that the raven says that he doesn't want to go is he's like, you're just sending me away because you want to have sex with my wife when I leave. That the raven says that to Noah. You want to have sex with my raven wife, right? And Noah says, oh, I can't, how dare you? God has forbidden to me to sleep with even my own wife during this period. All the more so, I'm not allowed to cheat on my wife through bestiality with a bird, right? So I was like, wow, what a weird thing to say. But that's the lead in. And then all of a sudden, the Talmud realizes that there's an interesting point that has been made sort of along the way, which is that God forbade Noah to have sex. It certainly doesn't say that in the text. And actually, it's true. as a matter of Jewish law, when you are in a time of a great crisis, there, like along with fasting and other things, there are times when the Jewish community will take abstinence upon themselves as a way of saying, if there's too much death outside, like it doesn't make sense to be engaged in sexual delight or procreation, right? Like it's just a horrifying, right, time. That's actually recorded in the Shulchan Aruch. But the Talmud, after this funny story with the raven, nevermore. Funny story with the raven, the Talmud says, well, wait, like how do we know that you weren't allowed to have sex? And they notice a very interesting thing that I want to share with you. So take a look at the next source here, and let's try, this one we'll have to go slowly with and make sure we understand. How do we know that sex was forbidden on the ark? From the verse in Genesis 6, and you shall come into the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. While further on, and this is true in Genesis 8, 2 chapters later, it is written, go forth from the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Okay, let's just make sure we caught that. Can someone explain what just happened here? How do we know that sex was forbidden on the ark? What are they saying here? This is not an easy read. Let's see. Anyone be able to just parse this out for us? What's happening here? Let me get a hand for someone who will. Matt Silverstein. Hello, Matt.
They don't have any more kids.
They
what?
don't.
There are no grandkids. There are no more kids.
That's a great point and guess, but that's not what they're getting at.
Damn, darn.
Right. Good to see you, Matt. Other thoughts? What's happening? Let's just take a look. Again, it's these two verses that are supposed to illuminate for us that they couldn't have sex on the ark. Why? I think Rachel. Oh, I can't hear you. I can't hear you, Rachel. I can't hear you.
I didn't say it. It's in the chat, and Shea said it.
Great.
By gender on the way in, and they're not on the way out.
Good, exactly. Okay,
that's not me.
Perfect. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Anshia. Appreciate both of you because you're both, I think, correct here. The phrasing is you come into into the ark with your sons, and then your wife and your sons' wives. It's just like I wouldn't even notice it. It's just the way that they're ushered into the ark, and it's a patriarchy. Like they speak of men first, but notice that it's Noah, Noah's sons, Noah's wife, Noah's sons' wives. And then in chapter 8, when they leave the ark, it says, go you and your wife and your sons' wives. Now the husbands and wives have come together. So, right, like I almost want to call and so speak this out for me, but you can hear the rest of the thought. Like the idea is that God was saying, when you go into the ark, separate, don't be together with your partner. And now when you come out of the ark, you can come back together again. Okay, and now that is true. It does say, I will establish my covenant with you and you shall enter the ark with your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives. And then it says, go forth from the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. This is like an amazing thing. The rabbis are teaching us how to read, how to read carefully, to catch something like that and to make meaning of it. But I want to ask you, can you make meaning of that? Is that a legitimate move? Right? We're studying Parshanut here. We're studying the interpretation of the Torah. What do you think? Do you think it's fair to look at those little changes in language, just like in the order of something like that? And is that fair to say, oh, the Torah is hinting at something here? The Torah is telling us they had to separate and then they were able to come together. Anyone feel like, oh yeah, that makes sense to me? Okay, I'm turn back to Matt.
If you'd asked me 3-4 years ago, I would have said absolutely not. They're reading it in there, but there's so much depth of that kind of careful construction that I now really do think it was the people putting this together really did think through on that level. It's
Okay.
there's too many times where it makes cohesive sense across a bunch of text. It's not just, well, if I take a word in another letter. This,
Okay,
I mean, this.
I'm feeling great that Matt Silverstein has been slowly convinced that there is a kind of composing brilliance going on in the Torah. What do other people think? I saw Lila had a thought.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it matters if we think like this particular thing is earned or not, because if we pick up on the word, Bedorotav, and we say, like, if we come in, we have to come in and with a premise that says, like every single word in the Torah matters. I think that's where the rabbis are operating from. And in that case, like, we can apply the same line of questioning to each word we come across, whether we like it, Bedorotav, because we can glean all this like really interesting meaning that resonates for us, or something like this, where maybe it seems, So
Okay,
it's
good.
a matter of
that's-
how you read, how you read.
That's right. Either this is a discovery of the Torah's very careful wording and a discovery that the Torah intends through its very careful wording to message something to us, and then it's up to us to figure out what the message is, or this is a discourse. This is a mode of interpretation where we presume that every nuance is worthy of interpretation, and we create a narrative around these little, and Lila's saying it doesn't matter so much, right? I as you
I didn't mean it, sorry, I just to defend myself a little. I mean, I think it matters overall, and I think it's a very interesting question to me of like, what is this text and how do we read it? But I think like what I meant was like, we can't isolate this question of like, do we buy this? Can they interpret it this way? We have, because we've already talked about Bedorotav. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like we're entering into this class with the assumption in the that these words all mean something and are intentional, and like there's no, what's that phrase about like there's no extra word in the Torah. So anyway.
Yeah.
I won't cut you off again, I'm done.
No, I'm trying to make sure I understand your point, which is like, this is the mode, like we've already bought into it. Is that, I mean, like, no, because I'm not totally understanding. Like, are you saying that just by virtue of studying the Torah, we're in that's one of the rules of the game? Like, every word counts.
You want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think you have to believe that, but I think that like, once we say this is a kind of divine text, whatever that means, so that every word, like there's something happening intentional, there's something intentional with each and every, then it's all fair game, that line of questioning. And that like, if the Torah is ours and we see something in it, like it's there,
Right.
So there's a possibility for it being there.
Right. Okay. But I still think there's a distinction between that, that like interpretive assumption and a different claim, a stronger claim, which is that the Torah has a level of complexity that we are discovering. And I guess like, it's interesting for me to go back and forth with you on this, because you probably know that I think that is true. Like, I think that the Torah does have a level of complexity that the interpretive tradition is not just inserting, but discovering. And I want to make a claim for that by just adding one more thing to our analysis so far. And I think it actually ends up being critical, not just for this very interesting interpretive conversation, but also just for the bigger question we have to zoom out again on, which is what's going on with Noah. Take a look at this. This to me is quite striking. And again, I don't think this settles the case, but it's why I tend to think there's something going on here that the rabbis are tapping into rather than creating. So as the rabbis pointed out, Genesis chapter 6, you shall enter the ark with your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives. Genesis chapter 8, afterwards, go forth from the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds, animals, and everything that creeps on earth. Let them swarm on the earth and be fertile and increase on the earth. Now listen. So Noah went forth together with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives. Notice that? Noah went forth together with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives. This is 2 verses later, but it's a return to this order, right? So now, I don't know. I mean, it's still not conclusive, but it is interesting given the rabbis are saying that God said, don't have sex. And then the rabbis are saying, basically, you can have sex, or you can be together, or you can be intimate, or whatever. And then the question is, so then how do we read this last line here, where Noah leaves in the order of separation that he entered the ark in? What does that mean? Right? What does that mean? How do we read that? Right? If we follow the rabbis, they weren't allowed to have sex on the ark. God's now like, okay. And by the way, it's not just that God said that the rabbis aren't just leaning on that. They're also leaning on another thing we read, right? What did God keep saying to Noah when Noah left the ark? Be fruitful and multiply, right? Be fruitful and multiply. Abound on the earth and increase on it. So on some level, God's like, okay, let's get the procreation going. So how do we read that last line? I mean, both in answer to the question, does this seem intentional? The Torah is going back and forth, and either way, what would it mean in the rabbinic interpretation that we've been studying to say that God said separate, then God said come together, but Noah didn't come together? What does that mean? Okay, Rachel.
So when I think about like, well, why would they not, would it matter if they not have sex on the ark? And that's what we're looking at. If you think about like, I don't know, I've been in a water spout and it's terrifying. Like you don't know if you're going to survive. So like, if you don't know that there's any hope of survival for like the human population, like does it make sense to procreate? Like not necessarily like God said, I'm going to save you, but they're basically like the earth is being flooded. I just think of that as, I can't imagine having hope in that time. And then like, this is kind of a very, I don't know if it's a dark read, but there's a new book coming out about the Holocaust that talks a lot about like the sexual violence that happened that people have like shied away from and said we shouldn't publish this because we shouldn't talk about it. And it talks about, I think like a midwife who like would help with abortions or like killing a baby so that like the mothers and the other women could survive. Like, and that is also like, there is a time of like, should there be life right now because things are bad and there are people that feel that way with global warming, and I'm not moralizing one way or the other, but I think that there's just like a reading there of like, I don't know, but then
no, I think that's it. You do know. You gave us the reading. That is to say, what you said is so important, that there may be here an insight into where Noah's mind was at, where Noah's consciousness, where Noah's heart was at when Noah left the ark.
And that's the other thing I think that proves it is when he gets drunk. I mean, like, I remember after Hurricane Sandy in New York, what did we do in the hurricane? We got drunk. What did we do at the beginning of the pandemic? Like, that is it the best response to trauma? Whatever. But it is a response, as it's an escapism. But I think there's so much parallel here. And the parallel that I struggle with is not necessarily in this section. It's when they come out of the ark and God says, I won't do this again because you're in my divine image. And it's like, well, that's exactly what you said to Adam. This isn't the first time you're saying that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's so interesting. It's like, well, are you remembering that we're in your image? Are you regretful? Not like, is this God saying mea culpa when he says, never again shall I do that? Because that is the language.
Okay. So you're doing a great job of basically incorporating you're doing the work for us, and that's great. But I do want to underline the central like claim that you're making here, which is that perhaps Noah is a person who is terrified of bringing new life into the world. That's really important to take account of. That the first thing that God said to Noah is, this world has gone corrupt and I'm killing everyone. And that happens. And Noah experiences that. And then God says, okay, time to start over. And Noah says, no way. No way. Like, I'm not bringing a child into this world. What if you get mad again? And you said you wouldn't. Oh, you said you wouldn't. I have to share with you, since we're, and then we'll try and take as many last comments as we can. But this is my, I said we're going to be studying in Parshanut this year, interpretation. If I had to pick a favorite commentator, my absolute favorite, it's probably Rabbi Shlomo Ephraim Lunshitz of Prague, who's the chief rabbi of Prague, whose commentary is called the Kli Yakar. And it's one of the first commentaries to get really, I think, psychologically interesting. And the Kli Yakar says something essentially the same as what Rachel was just saying. So I just want you, it's so beautiful. I want you to see how, what kind of nuance and richness we can find in the commentaries here. So the Kli Yakar notices what we just noticed. Noah went forth together with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives. And the Kli Yakar says, it says again in the emergence from the ark that Noah went forth together with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives, even though the Holy Blessed One had permitted Noah to have intercourse again. Nevertheless, he would not accept it, for he said, perhaps they will continue to sin and the waters of the flood will come and wash them away. And why should one give birth into this emptiness and chaos? Why should one yolid l'reik l'behala? I mean, I just want, like, so maybe we're beginning to understand what Noah was thinking and what Noah's was dealing with. And I want to say something that many of you may be thinking, which is that I've heard this a lot lately. I don't know about you, but I've heard this a lot lately from people worried, pregnant people worried about what it means to have a child right now. You know, parents of little kids that are feeling like, oh my God, why did we bring a child into this world? Like that, I feel like is a real live fear that I hear, you know, from my compatriots, right, in this day and age. So maybe Noah was feeling the same thing, right? Like maybe that's how we're to understand the story, is that Noah didn't want to start over. Noah didn't want to begin a new covenant, begin a new system, no, Noah's done. And yes, he wants to get drunk and just forget, but he's definitely not going to be fruitful and multiply. All right, we'll take a couple more comments before we go. Sam? Oh, yeah.
I think there might be one more piece that's interesting to me, that it's not either or, which is this idea of first things first. So the idea of go forth and multiply indicates to me this future thing. I mean, it's not like you're saying go have sex the minute you get off the ark and then going backwards and bring all of the animals with you. So it's like he's giving them this future directive and then saying, but do the first things first. And so Noah kind of reverts to, before you make these big plans for your future and your little universe and your nuclear family, make sure all is right with the world and take care of these vulnerable creatures. And that you can't just take this direction, like we're on earth to have a family and make babies and do our own, stay in our own lane, that we have to do it in the context of our responsibilities to the vulnerable and the weaker around us. And that was his job. And as the shepherd of all of these little creatures. So I think that maybe both are true, but there's this idea of do your duties first and then do the big dream.
Yeah. And Noah did his duties, as we've been saying all along. And we can't take that away from him. But maybe he couldn't do the big dream. He couldn't start the new nation. He couldn't be our forefather, right? That we have to wait for Abraham for that, right? Liz.
So the one thing that keeps standing out for me is this context that God has just destroyed the world. God is destroying the world. And if you think about how a child feels when the parent loses control, you know, here everything that's gone up until this point has been creation, and God's been doing all this stuff, and God has been creating the world and doing you know, establishing people and communities and all of this, and now God is destroying it all. And for Noah, his perspective of what's happening, you know, I mean, we don't know, you know, we don't have a sense of where he was, where his head was at. But if this is the all-powerful God and God's destroying everything, it's like, yeah, I'll just do what I'm told. But, you know, I mean, there's a sense of fear that a child will be very scared when a parent loses control, and it feels like that's what God's doing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we don't know how Noah experienced any of this. He doesn't really talk about it, right? But was Noah thinking, I'm going to save all life on earth? Or was Noah like, okay, just get in the ark? You know, it's hard to know. It's hard to know. And, you know, he did his job. I mean, he did his job. But do we see a narrative develop where Noah cannot handle the idea of confronting life again? I mean, the birth is a kind of is an image for that, but really just like it becomes more than just about birth. It's about life. Can life go on after such tragedy? Is that possible? All right, one last thought from Payam.
I sort of read it as a commentary on Jewish sex, because I mean, there's animals, and the animals were male and female, so you know the animals were procreating and having sex. So it's kind of a question of why wasn't Noah allowed to while the animals were? Like, what is the difference between, you know, so it's like delineating between why or when humans can versus when the animals can. And I think it has to do something with hope and love. And, you know, it's almost like when the flood came, God took his love out of the world. Right. And so like in a world without love, like humans aren't allowed to have sex. Yeah.
It's really beautifully put, Payam. I mean, the whole story, right? We've been contrasting Noah with Abraham, but Noah's surrounding companions are the animals. And like, you know, Noah's not an animal. Maybe the animals, you release them from the ark and they go off and they, you know, like rabbits, you know, but Noah's different and we're different, and our relationship to life, to procreation, to all those, yeah, they're biological, but that's not what they are. They're also hope and love and, you know, faith, right? And Noah maybe doesn't have that anymore. Just close by showing you the last line of the Noah story. I think, you know, if we've been constructing this narrative that we're like birth and sex and the sort of like the hesitation around that is a part of the story. Note, as we did before, that that God is like, be fruitful and multiply, be fruitful and multiply. That language is quite striking, be fruitful and multiply. Right, that's the chapter 9 there. But if we scroll down to the end of chapter 9, Noah's story ends like this. Noah lived after the flood 350 years. And all the days of Noah came to 950 years. And then he died. For 350 years, Noah lived. And how many children did Noah have? 3, right? First 3 that we saw at the outset. Noah had 3 sons. They went with him into the ark. They came out again. Now, I mean, it was 600-year-old man, right? Like that. But in the context of the story, Noah could have had centuries of more children. But he's done. Just leave me alone, and I'm going to just die. And that's the end of the Noah story. So that is at least one take, and we've heard many others, on why Noah is a hero, but a kind of a tragic hero, right? A kind of a, not failed, he didn't fail, but he was perhaps broken in some deep way that prevented him from becoming the founder of the new humanity, right? Even as he was the savior of the old humanity. Okay, good to see you next week on Thursday, okay? Nice to learn with you all today, and welcome to the new season of learning. Bye, everyone.